This tank was so secret that most Soviet generals didn't even know it existed. A machine that came out of nowhere and turned the world of tank design upside down. NATO feared it so much that for decades they refused to believe in the reality of its main weapon. But what if I told you that the greatest triumph of Soviet engineers almost ended in colossal failure because of an ordinary soldier's boot? And that this tank, which became a legend, was initially hated by the very men who had to fight in it. This video is the story of a forbidden genius, an invisible tank that was a full generation ahead of its time. You will learn what monstrous mistake the designers made, which caused the newest machines to break down en masse, driving the command to despair. What kind of hellish carousel they hid inside the turret, and why the West still can't perfectly replicate how it works. How the world's lowest tank became a nightmare for NATO gunners, and why its silhouette drove Pentagon analysts crazy. And most importantly, what weapon straight out of science fiction novels was fitted to this machine, allowing it to destroy an enemy from a distance where it couldn't even be seen. This isn't a story about steel. It's a story about a revolution they tried to hide, about genius that pushed back against the system, and about how one machine forced the entire world to play by its rules. Ready to learn how the weapon that defined the face of modern warfare was created? Then watch till the end.
The year is 1967, a remote testing ground somewhere near Kharkiv. A few high-ranking Soviet army officers, privy to the strictest secret, are witnessing something impossible. On the firing line sits a squat, unfamiliar steel machine. A command is given, and the silence is shattered not by a single shot, but a continuous, eardrum-rupturing roar. 10 shells, one after another with mere seconds between them, race toward targets 2 kilometers away. The generals, men who had seen it all, cannot believe their eyes. No tank in the world is capable of this. And when they are shown the hatch and the interior, the shock only deepens. There is no room in the turret for a 4th crew member, the loader. His job is done by a cunning mechanism. And so, in an atmosphere of total secrecy, the world was presented with the T-64, a machine that didn't just outrun its time, it ruthlessly rewrote all the rules of tank warfare. This technological breakthrough was the answer to the challenge of the fiercest confrontation, the Cold War. The mid-1950s, the arms race is accelerating wildly. When the British fit their Centurions with a new powerful 105mm gun capable of hitting Soviet tanks from unprecedented ranges, the USSR parries the blow by creating the T-62 with a 115mm gun. But that was just a symmetrical response. The generals and designers understood clearly, to win the race, you needed not a counterpunch, but a crushing leap forward by a whole generation. The key to this leap found the living legend, Alexander Alexandrovich Morozov, creator of the victorious T-34. His analytic mind saw the dead end that simply increasing armor thickness and gun caliber was leading. Tanks were turning into sluggish, heavy monsters, and their crews were physically unable to cope. The main bottleneck was the human, the loader. As the caliber increased, shells became heavier, and even a strong man in the heat of battle would quickly tire, nullifying the rate of fire. Morozov set his Kharkiv Design Bureau a task that seemed heretical: to completely eliminate the human from the loading process, to create a tank where a shell would be sent into the barrel by an automaton. And so, in deep secrecy, work began on Project Object 432.
This wasn't just another modernized tank, it was a philosophical and technical revolution made flesh in metal. Engineers struggled to create a unique mechanism with a rotating carousel container that had to find, feed, and ram a shell at the gunner's command. But a brilliant idea on a blueprint is one thing. Could this steel brain work with unrivaled speed in dust, in frost, under vibration, and in the hellish stress of real combat? The first prototype had to go through a harsh, merciless ordeal where any failure could put an end to the entire revolution. When Object 432 first rolled out of the workshop, it looked like no known tank. Its silhouette was deliberately squat and low, just 2 meters 17 centimeters, making it a difficult target. Inside lay real technical magic. Instead of a loader, a compact automatic loader with a carousel mechanism. Between the steel armor plates, a special filler, creating an impenetrable sandwich for shaped charge, heat shells. And instead of the usual steel road wheels, lightweight aluminum ones. This was a machine built to the formula of the future: maximum power with minimal mass and size. During the very first factory tests, the prototype showed staggering results. Its rate of fire, up to 8 rounds per minute, was twice that of any serial tank in the world. The composite armor confidently held hits that would pierce ordinary steel clean through. Success seemed assured, but then came the real exam set by the military inspectors. The machine was driven through the sands of Central Asia and the swamps of Belarus, forced to overcome water obstacles and steep climbs. And in these extreme conditions, the revolution's Achilles heel revealed itself: the new super-compact 5TDF diesel engine. This engine, which allowed the tank to be so low, proved to be monstrously finicky. It demanded perfectly clean fuel, the strictest observance of warm-up and maintenance routines. The slightest deviation and the engine failed. Reliability, the cornerstone of any military hardware, was in serious doubt. Alexander Morozov and his team understood. Without a reliable heart, the most advanced tank was just an expensive toy. Frenzied, almost round-the-clock work on improvements began. The engineers literally lived on the testing grounds, analyzing every breakdown, making hundreds of design changes. The pressure was colossal. The Cold War wasn't waiting, and the West was already working on its machines. By the mid-1960s, through titanic effort, the problems were mostly solved. The engine's service life was significantly increased. The autoloader worked more stably. In 1966, under the same veil of absolute secrecy, the revolutionary machine was officially adopted for service under the index T-64. The main obstacle seemed overcome, but in reality, the most complex and unpredictable stage was just beginning. Now this cybernetic complexity, this tank computer, had to be handed over to simple soldiers and sergeants accustomed to the reliable mechanics of the T-54. The army for whom this masterpiece was created met it not with enthusiasm, but with bewilderment and a dull fear. The Army's first contact with the T-64 was a culture shock, comparable to the transition from an abacus to a personal computer. For tankers, whose professional world was built on tactile connection with iron, on the sound of the engine, the loader's muscle memory, an intuitive understanding of mechanics, the new machine seemed like a cold and alien cybernetic organism. Its fighting compartment, lacking a fourth crew member, was perceived not as a breakthrough, but as a kind of dangerous void. Buttons, switches, and unfamiliar instruments in place of familiar mechanical controls instilled not confidence, but a deep anxiety. What if all this breaks down in battle? How do you fix it with your bare hands? The prestige of the new technology was falling even at the training stage. This psychological alienation instantly spilled over into the harsh reality of failure statistics. Field mechanics, raised on the philosophy of hit it with a hammer, it'll work, encountered the 5TDF engine, which demanded treatment closer to that in a laboratory. Neglecting the multi-stage warm-up and winter conditions, using substandard fuels and oils, trying to squeeze everything out of the engine without proper break-in, all this led to the predictable outcome. Defective power units piled up in workshops, and in unit reports, the T-64 was increasingly mentioned not as a new formidable weapon, but as a temperamental and unreliable piece of equipment. Realizing the scale of the problem, the military leadership did not make concessions, but radically tightened the training system. They created not just courses, but closed elite training centers where entry was by competition. Here, future instructors were immersed not only in the tank's design, but in the very philosophy of its creation. They were taught not how to turn it, but why it's built this way. They analyzed every engine failure, studied the hydraulics of the autoloader, grasped the logic of the optical rangefinder. These men were to become not mechanics, but technologist evangelists, capable of conveying to the ordinary tanker the idea that the T-64's reliability was not a given, but the result of the strictest discipline and deep understanding. And this titanic work began to bear fruit. Returning to their units, the retrained officers and sergeants became crystallization points for the new approach. Fear of the unfamiliar hunk of metal was gradually replaced by respect for a precision instrument. The number of breakdowns caused by personnel sharply decreased. And then, finally, the layer of technical problems and psychological barriers was removed. The Army stopped fighting the tank and began merging with it into a single whole. It was at this moment that the real miracle happened. Tactical exercises turned into a demonstration of absolute superiority. Crews that had tamed their T-64s suddenly realized what a monstrous weapon they had in their hands. The very qualities that Morozov and his team had originally built into it, qualities that were inaccessible as long as the tank was seen as a problem, not a solution. Having mastered the machine, the crews saw its true face, the face of a ruthless and efficient duelist. The first and most shocking advantage was firepower. While the crew of a Western tank, like the British Chieftain or early American M60, could manage 3 to 4 shots in a minute of combat, the T-64's crew delivered 7 to 8. During training exercises, it looked like this. The enemy had just fired its first shell and was preparing a second when it was already covered by a hail of return fire. This gave birth to a new tactic. Tankers learned to bet on the first shot, knowing they always had time for a quick correction and a second strike while the enemy was just reloading. The second advantage was geometrical. The low, squat silhouette of 2 meters 17 centimeters, half a meter lower than most contemporary machines, ceased to be just a design feature and became a tactical weapon. Commanders learned to use folds in the terrain, the slightest hills and bushes behind which the T-64 could literally hide, leaving only a barely noticeable turret in view. Detecting and identifying such a target at a distance was many times harder, sharply increasing the survivability of the tank on the battlefield. The third trump card was unprecedented accuracy. The inbuilt optical rangefinder and ballistic computer removed from the gunner the most difficult task, estimating distance by eye and intuitively calculating corrections. Now he simply aimed the mark at the target, aligned the rangefinder marks, and the automation made corrections for distance, shell type, and even crosswind. The result was stunning. Experienced gunners began to consistently hit targets with the first shot from 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, a range that for NATO tankers was a matter of sniper's luck, not standard practice. Even skeptical driver mechanics were forced to admit the light suspension with small aluminum road wheels, initially met with distrust, proved not just reliable, but outstanding. It provided a smooth ride and good handling, and the characteristic pattern of 6 pairs of small wheels became the tank's unique, recognizable signature, its business card by which it was unmistakably distinguished from any other machine in the world. Thus, the T-64 proved its superiority not on parade grounds, but in the harsh conditions of exercises and proving grounds. It forced a revision of the very doctrine of tank combat. But for Alexander Morozov and his team, this was just the first stage. While the Army was mastering the basic model, the walls of the Kharkiv Design Bureau were already seething with work on the next crushing blow. They were preparing a modification that was meant not just to surpass the West, but to forever erase the line between tank classes, giving birth to an entirely new type of weapon.
Fitting the 125mm gun was not simply a tube-for-tube replacement, but a complex surgical operation on the entire tank organism. The new D-81T 2A46 gun wasn't just bigger, it generated colossal dynamic loads when fired. The engineers essentially had to redesign the gun's mounting points in the turret and refine the 2E23 Cyclone weapon stabilization system so the heavy barrel wouldn't wander after recoil and would retain aiming accuracy. But the main puzzle remained the autoloader. The carousel, designed for 115mm rounds, was too small. The designers performed another round of brilliant improvisation. They didn't just enlarge it, but completely reconfigured the layout, creating a more rational scheme for placing the now separate case propellant charges and projectiles in the conveyor. As a result, despite the increase in ammunition size, the rate of fire was kept at the same phenomenal level, 8 rounds per minute. It was a victory of intellect over brute physics. The appearance of the T-64A in 1968 put a definitive end to the entire post-war tank classification. Until that moment, Western and Eastern military thought revolved around the idea of specialization. Light tanks like the AMX-13 and PT-76 for reconnaissance and amphibious assault. Medium tanks like Pattons and T-55 as the workhorses of the front. Heavy tanks like Conquerors and later IS models as battering rams for breaking fortified lines. The T-64A blew this system apart. It was too well protected thanks to composite armor for a medium tank and too fast, over 60 kilometers per hour, and small for a heavy one. Its gun outclassed in caliber the weapons of all Western heavyweights. It was a universal fighter, capable of fighting mobile battles, holding the defense, and leading a breakthrough. The term main battle tank, MBT, introduced to designate it, quickly ceased to be Soviet internal jargon and became a global standard. Armies had to admit the future lay not in a park of specialized machines, but with a single, perfected, universal one. The realization of this in the West caused not just concern, but strategic shock. Intelligence that penetrated the Iron Curtain painted a picture they initially refused to believe. A tank superior in key parameters to everything NATO had and produced in series? This meant that in the event of a hypothetical conflict in Central Europe, the alliance's armored forces would face a qualitatively superior opponent. A frantic, incredibly costly race began. The Americans sped up work on the M1 Abrams, the Germans on the Leopard 2, trying to somehow achieve parity. But catching up with an opponent who had already set the rules of the new game
was agonizingly difficult. However, for the Kharkov Design Bureau led by Morozov, the T-64A was just another milestone, not the final stop. While NATO headquarters racked their brains over how to counter the 125mm gun, the USSR was already testing a system that made the very concept of direct fire obsolete. They were working to give the tank the ability to hit the enemy at such distances that he wouldn't even suspect a threat. A weapon was being prepared that would turn the T-64 from the king of tank duels into a true long-range killer. The pinnacle of the T-64's evolution was something that went beyond traditional tank design. In 1976, the T-64B modification entered service, equipped with the 9K112 Cobra AT-8 Songster guided weapon system. Now the tank could fire not just shells, but guided missiles directly from its 125mm barrel. This was a qualitative leap, changing the very nature of tank combat. Effective firing range against armor increased to 4 kilometers, twice the usual duel distance. Now the T-64B crew could hit an enemy at a range where it was simply invisible or couldn't effectively return fire. And the missile was versatile. It allowed for the high-precision destruction of both fortified firing points and low-flying helicopters, turning the tank into a multifunctional platform for precision-guided munitions. When details of this system leaked to the West, it caused not just alarm, but genuine panic in analytical centers. The technology of firing a missile through a tank gun seemed fantastic and unworkable to NATO engineers due to monstrous overloads and guidance complexity. Its existence forced an urgent revision of all scenarios for a possible conflict in Europe. Now, Soviet tank units had a huge advantage at long approach distances. But the T-64's influence was not limited to its modifications. It became the genetic father of all subsequent Soviet tank manufacturing. Its revolutionary solutions were picked up and adapted by other design schools. In Nizhny Tagil, based on its concept but with a focus on manufacturability and cost reduction, they created the T-72, the most mass-produced main battle tank in history. In Leningrad, taking the layout and armament of the T-64A as a basis, but installing a gas turbine engine, the speedy T-80 was born. These three families, T-64, T-72, T-80, carried a common Kharkiv gene: the autoloader, the powerful 125mm gun, the three-man crew, and the low silhouette. The Army's attempts to copy or create an analog of the autoloader long ended in failure due to its complexity and reliability requirements. As a result, NATO flagships, the American M1 Abrams and the German Leopard 2, even in later modifications, retained a crew of 4, where the loader remained the weak link, limiting the rate of fire and increasing vulnerability. This was clear evidence of the technological lead that Soviet engineers had secured back in the 1960s. Thus, the T-64 fulfilled its historical mission. It didn't just create a new tank, it gave birth to a new philosophy, defining the development of armored vehicles for decades to come. But with the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, the secrets of Object 432 ceased to be an absolute mystery, and the question arose, what would await this legend in a new, changed reality, where its brainchild, the MBT concept, had become the common property of the world? The legacy of the T-64 cannot be measured merely by the number of machines built or their years in service. It proved to be far more fundamental, a legacy cast into standards and written into textbooks. The technological principles first serially embodied in the Kharkiv tank ceased to be a Soviet secret and became the global language of tank design. Composite armor, which was a revolutionary sandwich of steel plates and special filler, ceased to be exotic. Its concept became the basis for the protection of all modern main battle tanks without exception, be it the American M1A2 SEP, the German Leopard 2 A7, or the Israeli Merkava. Complex fire control systems with laser range finders, digital ballistic computers, and thermal imagers are direct descendants and further developments of that very 1G21 Rubin optical sight rangefinder, which for the first time allowed the T-64's gunner to know, not guess, the exact distance to the target. And most importantly, the very organizational technical concept of the main battle tank as a single universal platform replacing a park of specialized machines, that is the direct and undeniable child of the philosophy embedded in Object 432. After 1991, the fate of the T-64, like that of the entire country, became complicated. Thousands of these machines, once the elite of Soviet forces in Europe, remained in the arsenals of new independent states. They went through a series of modernizations, T-64BV, T-64BM Bulat, receiving new fire control systems, explosive reactive armor, improved engines. Their role changed. From a superweapon for breaking through NATO fronts, they became a powerful, reliable, and well-mastered reserve, an important but no longer primary link. The palm of leadership passed to the later and more technologically adapted for mass production T-72 and its deep modernizations, and then to new generations T-80, T-90, and finally T-14 Armata. But this is precisely where the amazing viability of the ideas embedded in the T-64 lies. They did not become obsolete, they evolved. The layout with the carousel autoloader and three-man crew, the powerful smooth-bore gun of large caliber, active and dynamic protection, the low silhouette, all these cornerstones of the modern tank can be traced back directly to their pioneer. The philosophy of Alexander Morozov, which rejected the dead-end path of mindlessly increasing mass in favor of intellectual superiority, compactness, and revolutionary solutions, proved prophetic for decades ahead. He proved that advantage is born not in a race of megatons, but in a race of megabytes and engineering insights. Thus, the history of the T-64 is much more than the chronicle of creating a successful combat vehicle. It is the history of a daring, deliberate, and brilliantly executed leap across an entire technological generation. A bold, asymmetry answer to the challenge of an era. A technological victory achieved not by copying captured samples or espionage, but by the strength of one's own scientific thought and design will. The T-64 became a living symbol of the fact that true revolution in military affairs matures not on parade grounds, but in an atmosphere of the strictest secrecy and fanatical dedication to the task. And its fruits, new principles, standards, and the very logic of development are used by the whole world, often without even realizing it. It will forever remain in history, not as a museum rarity, but as a powerful source from which all modern tank design flows.